Welcome to episode 3 of Miles Ahead, the Canadian Points podcast, brought to you by Frugal Flyer, where we talk about all things miles and points, a hobby that allows us to travel all over the world in style and on a budget. Today we're joined by myself, Reed, as well as Josh and Jeff, and new to the podcast is Kirin Sang, who is also our newest writer. Welcome to Miles Ahead, Kirin.
Thanks for having me here. I am looking to find a better way to travel more and pay less.
So today we're going to be talking about one thing and one thing only, redeeming miles and points for travel. We're mostly going to be talking about flights, but we'll touch on hotels and other types of redemptions too. We figured a great way to start things off would be for each of us to share our latest or standout points redemption with a focus specifically on how we booked it, what points we used, just to provide an example of what's possible with this hobby of miles and points. Josh, did you want to start us off with your favorite redemption?
For sure. So last November, I booked a trip to Japan, actually, and that trip is happening this fall. So I booked it about 11 months out. If anyone's been looking to travel to Japan, you definitely know how hard it is to find award availability when it comes to flights. Japan is incredibly hot right now, and for all the right reasons. I know Reed and Kirin on this call have both visited, and they said it was excellent. So in making this trip happen, it was going to be for 2 people, myself and my significant other. And as I mentioned, flights were the biggest piece. So I had my balance of Air Canada Aeroplan points. I had a balance of British Airways Avios points. And I started searching using a tool called seats.aero. This is a really great search aggregator tool when it comes to award flights. You can put in city pairings or broad geographic pairings, and it'll spit out availability for a set period of time. And that time range is very expansive if you pay for their premium membership. So I was looking regularly. I'd search it a couple times a day typically, and I actually found the flights back from Tokyo Haneda through Seattle, through Vancouver, back to Edmonton. So without even thinking about it, I booked the 2 seats, no questions asked, as I knew this was half the battle in finding that round trip to Japan. Shortly after booking that, I jumped into British Airways Avios and started searching for flights to go there. There's nothing direct from Edmonton, of course, so I knew I was going to need to position myself, most likely the night before, in a West Coast city that flies using Japan Airlines. So I actually found availability just searching directly on the British Airways Avios site for San Francisco to Tokyo Haneda flight that left at noon for 2 people. The taxes and fees were a little bit higher booking through British Airways Avios, but still completely reasonable. And again, this was the other piece of my puzzles. So I now had both of those flights booked. The rest of it was easy, filling in the holes with hotel bookings. I had a number of Hilton free night certificates that I was looking to utilize from some of the Hilton US credit cards. And so we booked a number of properties, including the Conrad Osaka, the Conrad Tokyo, and the Roku Kyoto LXR. So once I had those flights, that was all I needed to do. So what about you, Jeff? What's your favorite or most recent award booking, and how did you make it happen?
Well, if you've been following the site, you will have seen that I reviewed Lufthansa's brand new Allegris cabin concept on their new A350s. And this was actually the most recent flight I took. I booked it via Aeroplan for 70,000 Aeroplan points. It was just a simple 1-segment flight. The way I went about initially booking it, because I knew I probably wasn't going to be able to find award availability on Lufthansa when I wanted to book. So generally what I will do is go into seats.aero and try to find the next best acceptable alternative, just as a backup in case Lufthansa award availability doesn't show up. So I settled on initially an Air France flight home through JFK just because they're operating their newest business class on the JFK route. So I thought that would be kind of neat to try. And sure enough, about 3 weeks prior to that, I got a notification, or an alert, I guess I should say, from seats.aero. And if you're not familiar with alerts, you can basically set an alert on seats.aero to search for award availability for you rather than having to go back to the website every day and check. So I set one of those alerts up, and I got the email about about 3 weeks before the flight, and I was at work, and I immediately got the email and had the flight booked within 2 minutes of getting that alert. And only one seat was released, which obviously makes things a lot easier because I was traveling by myself. If I'm traveling with someone else, like you said, Josh, it's a lot harder to find 2 seats. So thankfully, I just needed 1 seat, and I quickly snapped it up. I'll just touch on my Air France flight because I did end up canceling that flight. And when I'm booking a backup flight, as I guess I could call them, or a contingency flight, I'll generally try to do it through a program that I know has a decent cancellation policy. And Air France KLM Flying Blue isn't the best, but it's not the worst either. It's only $75 to cancel, which I kind of consider a cancellation fee a baked-in cost to doing award redemptions. Sometimes they're just unavoidable, but it's just kind of the fluid nature of award space and booking award flights. And it was a great flight. I don't really have anything to say regarding hotels during the trip because none of them were too memorable, but the trip overall was memorable, but the hotels weren't. And I think that pretty much covers it.
One point I would call out there is one of the benefits of miles and points is that quite often bookings with miles and points have more flexible cancellation policies than cash bookings, especially if you're looking at the different fare classes versus the most basic WestJet ultra basic fare class that we talked about last episode. Kirin, what about you?
So I'm going to be joining in on the single men's club because I was looking for a single ticket. Now, what's exciting about this particular redemption is that it's for something very specific. It is for a tour to the European and Asian sides of Turkey in areas that were historically part of the Roman and then later Byzantine empires, because I'm going on a historical tour, which I'm going to write all about. And it was a huge amount of money out of pocket. And I don't think I'm going to be inside of a 5-star hotel for pretty much the entire thing, which is fine. I don't need a Marriott every time. But it was interesting because I didn't realize just how agonizing it can be to try and get to Istanbul. So I went to my little trusty bank of points because I have 3 different programs. I have British Airways Avios, which we mentioned before. I have Alaska Miles, which has partners such as British Airways. And then I also had Air Canada Aeroplan. And not understanding at the time that I could have been using a program such as Seats.aero, I raw dogged it and used the stock searches on both of the websites. So British Airways for the Avios and Air Canada's app actually for Air Canada. That was an experience and suffering in of itself because of the exceptionally glitchy IT that both of those websites can suffer from, and then taking forever to search and then kicking responses to you. Now, ultimately what made the decision for me was the fact that if I had booked British Airways and I had booked it from, say, Vancouver or Toronto, I would have had to get myself there because I live in Edmonton, so I'd have had to position there, which would have cost a bunch of money out of pocket. And then also it was about $450 or $500 in taxes and fees both ways. And that's reduced from what the fuel surcharge used to be. They really want to get their money out of you when you make a business class redemption. Now, the interesting thing that I noticed is that if I had wanted to suffer a little bit, the fuel surcharges get cut into about a half, where they get cut by 60-70% if you go economy. But I'm spoiled. I'm a spoiled Sally, and I decided to take it with business. And for that, I used Air Canada, and I managed to find a couple flights. So one of them was routing from Edmonton to Montreal to Istanbul directly. And then on the way back, I got something really neat because Eurowings, which is one of the budget airlines out of Frankfurt, recently joined Star Alliance. So on the way back, I got Istanbul to Frankfurt to Calgary, sit in the Calgary lounge for 6 hours, and then get on a 21 minutes in the air flight back from Calgary to Edmonton, which I'm sure is going to be just a peachy treat. So this was really interesting because it enabled me to take a trip that I would have never imagined. If I had to pay for the flights out of pocket, this trip, which is already expensive, would have started getting sort of into the stratosphere.
I'm actually interested to see that Eurowings review once you fly that. I had a buddy who recently flew it, and it looked pretty solid for what it was outside of landing in Calgary, which is not that bad.
Honestly, I'm such a spoiled Sally in the sense that I care about lying flat and sleeping and just being comfortable, but the quality of the food, the vintage of the champagne, or even if it is champagne or sparkling wine, how nice the waitresses are, either to you as a customer or upon the eye, are essentially irrelevant to me. Yeah, so as for you, our lovely host, Mr. Reed, what have you gotten up to lately?
So my trip I want to talk about is my most recent big trip, which was to Asia with my significant other. This was a trip we planned ahead, but not as ahead of time as you might want to plan for miles and points. So about 4 months out, we kind of locked down a date that we wanted to travel. With miles and points, you always want to be able to book ahead of time as far as possible to get that better award availability. So in our case, there wasn't as much award availability, so we had to just find routings and flights that would work for us. We ended up flying through New York, which we couldn't even get to directly from Edmonton. So it wasn't the most simple or convenient trip routing, but we were able to fly on some really cool business class and even first class airlines. So for getting to our destination, which was Singapore for the first part of the trip, we used Aeroplan miles. We redeemed actually not for Air Canada, but for two partner airlines of Air Canada, Turkish Airlines from New York to Istanbul and Singapore Airlines from Istanbul to Singapore. And this only cost a total of 87,000 points per person for business class, which is great value. One of the benefits of Aeroplan is being able to book for really good value on partner airlines. For our flight home, we flew via Hong Kong to Los Angeles on Cathay Pacific First Class. I booked this by transferring from a few different points programs, but mostly American Express membership rewards. And I learned a lot of lessons through booking that, one of which was oftentimes when you book directly with the airline's own program, you'll find better availability of award flights. So I wasn't finding much on Cathay through other oneworld partners, as Cathay is a part of the oneworld alliance. But I was able to find availability directly with Cathay. And so that's why it made sense to transfer points to Cathay's Asia Miles program. I also learned another bit of a complication that can arise in miles and points is when you're transferring points, it can take, with some programs, up to a week for those points to arrive in the destination program account. So that presents a bit of a complication because if you have a flight that you're looking to book and you initiate the transfer, you may wind up with points stranded because that award could be booked in that time period where you're waiting for the points to arrive. So the solution to this was I had to call into Cathay, and they were able to do something called a ticket hold where they held the ticket for me. They only held it for 2 days, but I was able to keep calling in just before the ticket hold expires and extend the hold so that I was able to guarantee that the seats were still available for us. So overall, it was a great trip. We flew around the world westward, which is kind of a unique routing, but it does show, I think it shows some of the trials and tribulations of using miles and points. So these are all good examples of different ways you can leverage points to travel all over the world, and all of us can find ways to travel that are quite different, and you really can get out of this hobby what you want to. And I'll also make the point that you don't need to be traveling in business class all the time either. You can use miles and points for economy, premium economy, although most of us on this podcast today are biased towards those more aspirational awards. You'll see some more economy-focused content coming to Frugal Flyer in the short term. These are also good examples of how redemptions can be complicated. Earning points is relatively straightforward or formulaic, hence why we call it the science of earning points. Pick a points program, evaluate welcome offers, sign up, get approved, meet the spend, get the bonus. On the other hand, redeeming points has a lot more room for creativity, but that also means some work is required up front to get to the knowledge level required to finalize that first booking. So if you simply log into your chosen program, click book a flight, and redeem miles, and run a flight search and expect to get great results, you're likely going to leave a lot of value on the table. So there's many nuances to consider with booking award flights and redeeming your points. One of those nuances is to go to the very, very first step, searching for awards. So I'm curious, Josh, Jeff, Kirin, what are your guys' process when you first go to look for awards?
Yeah, I think using any of the aggregator tools that we have available to us is a fantastic way to start, not only for finding award availability, but also for looking for routing and better understanding the potential costs of the routes that you might be flying, whether you can get a direct flight or you're going to have to connect through somewhere. Using these aggregator tools, such as the previously mentioned Seats Arrow, really makes it easy to get a good baseline to understand how much it's going to cost, what to expect, and kind of just general airlines that fly that route if you have any preferences. Anyone else?
So when I book, I'm sort of two minds because there's two ways that things work for me. I have a rigid government job, so I have to let them know fairly long in advance of when I'm going to be away. At the same time, as a single dude, I get to choose when those dates are going to be, right? So the reason that this is so useful for me is because I can determine what my schedule is going to be. The issue is that I'm sort of locked into looking at things roughly 5 to 6 months in advance, which is the ideal spot, I think, for miles and points. It's just that that's when it's going to take me to get approved for vacation. And I'm sure that many people in the corporate world feel the same way. So with that being said, I've just found that the best way to book your award flights is just to be flexible. You have to think about, okay, can I survive leaving on a Tuesday or a Wednesday and potentially having to sacrifice a bit more vacation time or potentially having to work a half week before I get the flight that I want? And when I look at the flight, the important thing for me more than anything else is to get the flight that I want. You know, a lot of people in this space, I think, they're aviation enthusiasts as much as they are travel enthusiasts. So, if they see a product, an aspirational product that they really want to try out and it just released seats, they're going to book it and they're going to figure it out later. That's not a luxury that I always have, though I've definitely partaken of it before. So I have to be very conscientious of the dates that I'm choosing. And that means that I'm not always going to get the exact product that I want and that I have to be comfortable with that. The good thing is that there's always advantages to be found with this, especially coming from a second sort of location city in Canada, where I found that by virtue of taking a connecting flight out of Edmonton, dynamic pricing on things such as Aeroplan often works to my advantage. Similarly, because I'm taking connecting flights to other cities when I'm trying to use British Airways Avios to fly on airlines like Qatar or British Airways, or LATAM, for example, I can be very flexible about when I choose to get there because I can choose my arrival date based on when they're going to be releasing seats. And I do choose to fly those seats both in business class, which I prefer, but also occasionally in economy, especially if it's going to be a shorter flight. So for example, I would hate to fly economy in a 10-hour flight, but I can sometimes tough it out for 7. So that's sort of the considerations that I have. I'm more date focused, which is a double-edged sword because it means that you have to look somewhat in advance. But on the upside, it means that you're able to look at every permutation of every flight available on those dates. And you can choose a good deal on something like premium economy or economy, even if it didn't have that aspirational business class product I normally would have opted for.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, Jeff, if you were planning on booking a trip for 2 people, what does your searching process look like?
Yeah, so I basically start out by creating almost like a tier list of what would be my ideal trip, the perfect trip in terms of where it departs from, where it arrives to, and on the date I want as well. And then from there, I'll go to my next best option. And then after that, my third best option, and just kind of choose which airlines or airports I would want to depart from if it weren't Vancouver in my case, which is where I live. So for example, I might look at Seattle as a next option, or San Francisco or LA, and then generally go from there. And depending on how aspirational you want to get, I would probably expand my search even more than that. So for example, if I wanted to fly on, like in Reed's case, I know he had to reposition to LA to fly on Cathay Pacific first class. in that case, it's probably worth it. Or if I wanted to fly Japan Airlines or Emirates, I would probably be willing to position a lot more for those kinds of flights. And then from there, I would just start with my first choice. And if that's not available, I would just go to my next choice and so on down the line until I'm able to kind of work something together. And also, I feel like even though it may seem counterintuitive to a lot of people who just book vacations by just paying for it with their credit card, you have to kind of get comfortable with booking things last minute if you really want to find something that is ideal for your travel goals. And that's something that I found usually works out, even though there's always a lot of doubt. Generally, the closer you get in, the more options that tend to surface. So that's kind of how I generally approach it. But obviously, being flexible is the biggest thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that speaks to one of the biggest components that I think we're all very open to when it comes to searching for award availability is being flexible. So to all of us, what that looks like is you're open to different dates, you're open to different airports and using positioning flights. You might be booking 11, 12 months out. You might be booking 2 weeks out. Now, it's not to say that those are the only ways to book award flights, but implementing that flexibility, if you can have it with your career and schedule and general life, goes a long way because it opens up so many more opportunities where you're not just looking for one flight out of one airport. You might be searching the whole West Coast now and all of the major airports there for your desired flight. So that's another nuance with award availability is it's never really as straightforward as you might think to find it, even if you know how you're searching. Reed, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I often find when it comes time to book an award, I find myself wishing that I lived in Vancouver or Toronto because being at Edmonton, it's not a hub. And so often a positioning flight is something that's required. At the same time, if you're not booking close in or far out, then you quite often have to connect anyways. You might not find that perfect route. So something I find helpful, I often will start with a search. Typically, I'll decide on a destination I want to go to. I'll start searching backwards. So I'll go to a tool called Flight Connections, and I'll put in that destination. And then that tool will let you see all of the different routes and airlines that fly to that destination. And then from there, like Jeff mentioned, you can kind of construct a list of potential departing flights. And then it's just a question of finding a positioning flight to get to that departing airport.
Let's just be clear, just because there's seats on a flight doesn't mean that there's award availability. And that's one thing that I often think is confusing to people who are doing award searches or redeeming for the first time. Revenue fares or cash fares are very often a different bucket than award tickets, or we might get into the realm of dynamic pricing, which is a whole other beast. So just because there's seats available doesn't mean you'll be able to find award seats, or doesn't mean that award seats will become available. It's never a sure bet either way.
If I can cut in here, I would just like to give a little bit of my hot take. So I think one thing that we also sometimes lose the forest from the trees on when it comes to looking for award availability is that we always look for those best flights. We look for those aspirational Swiss Air business class, Qatar Q suites, all of the really cool things that even people such as us here at Frugal Flyer talk about a whole lot. We don't necessarily look for some of those other products that might be more pedestrian or which might cost more, or especially, and this is what I'm getting to as the crux of the issue, economy fares. Because I want to say this, unless there is a very, very popular flight happening at an absolutely peak time of season, you will almost always find economy fares at or near the lowest price on dynamic systems or at a reasonable fixed price for whatever the fixed price award program is. There's almost always economy. So if you're willing to just go through with economy, because that's when it works for your schedule and that's when it's going to work for you, you should go for it. Don't feel bad about not getting the quote unquote best, cents per point or the best mileage or flexing on the Instagram. Because I want to say this, I've flown a variety of business class fares. Nobody cares. The people with the money to pay for business class fares just pay for it, and it's a part of the life that they get as members of their class. And for the other people who are looking up to this aspirationally, there's now so much content on this. It's not necessarily something that everybody is going to find impressive for their purposes. You should fly business class for your comfort and for your enjoyment, not because of not because of expectations that were set there. And especially if you're traveling in a large group, such as a family, I regret to inform you, it's just going to be very, very difficult to find 4 or 5 or 6 business class award seats on any flight, especially at a reasonable price. It's just not happening if you're trying to go to Australia at Christmas, I hate to say.
Absolutely. And if you're looking to fly a family, you might have to get creative in flying different directions around the world to get to the same place, different flights, different days. It's not easy, to say the least.
But it can be an amazing way to save a lot of money. And if you think about this game not as a goal just to get the coolest flights, but as a game by which to minimize your out-of-pocket expenses, then this is absolutely the hobby for you.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, I read the award travel subreddit from time to time. And there's so many people that post about, rate my redemption is this, the whole concept is lost on me, frankly. Fly where you want to fly. But did any of you, when you were starting out in the world of miles and points, did you ever get kind of super locked in on getting the lowest price possible? And has your mindset shifted since then? Or have you always kind of had the same approach where it's finding the flight that works best for kind of your needs?
I think for me, early on, when I was still learning to earn points, when it came to redeeming, I was maybe coming from more of a mindset of scarcity. And so I wanted to find the absolute, best flight to spend the least amount of points. Now earning points has gotten a lot easier. And so you kind of have the luxury of, now I would say when I find a redemption that looks good enough, I don't tend to worry about, is there something cheaper out there or better value? So yeah, I definitely think it's something that as you get deeper into the hobby, your mindset will shift. And part of that is just building up your knowledge of the different programs and building up your ability to earn points and knowledge of the redemption side.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I see people oftentimes too ask if a redemption is good. In the time you ask, that redemption could be gone. That's the reality. So if there's something that looks good to you, as Jeff mentioned earlier on, know the cancellation terms of booking award tickets within that program. And even if it's a small fee or even free, frankly, be aware of it. Book the ticket you're interested in and figure it out later is always a good approach. If you wait too long and it's a good flight on a good airline and the availability is there, somebody else will book it. And that may be within the next 10 minutes, it might be within the next 24 hours. But there is a scarcity when it comes to award seats. So don't fall into that trap of waiting and hoping that it'll still be there.
Or the airline will change its pricing.
That too. Yeah, dynamic pricing.
I'll just jump in here and also mention that I believe all airlines in the United States and Canada are required by law to allow you to refund your tickets up to 24 hours after booking, including award tickets. So that's really something that you should be taking advantage of. If you see something that you think you might want to book, just go ahead and book it. And at least you've now secured it for 24 hours, which gives you time to think about it. And if you end up changing your mind, you can just end up canceling it for no charge. So that's something that you should always keep in the back of your mind.
Yeah, that's a fantastic tool.
The only exception I would say to that could be I was looking at a redemption through Royal Air Maroc, for example, and the only way to book it is by calling in. And so this is another topic in itself, but calling into airline programs can sometimes be a bit of a process, and you're not necessarily able to just get through right away. But yeah, I would say that's definitely something to take advantage of, is those flexible cancellation policies or refund policies.
Yeah, so I think I would just like to talk about dynamic for a second because this is a two-edged sword. It can cut against you, and probably in about 70 to 80% of cases, when you see that seat on the date that you want, it will cut against you. So dynamic pricing is when an airline's algorithm believes that there's a high or low demand for a flight and it prices it accordingly. So if it thinks that there's a low demand, it's going to really drop the price. If it thinks that there's a very high demand, it's going to jack it to the moon. Now, back in COVID, this was a lovely boon when things were dynamic because the planes were empty. So you could get business class flights for nothing. That's how I became a spoiled Sally flying business class all the time during the pandemic, basically. So unfortunately, now we are in an era of unprecedented uptick in the tourism industry to the point where it is causing a boom in the economy of Southern Europe. And so prices are very high again. With that being said, you can find very good redemptions, either if you're searching on specific dates, either very close or potentially very far in the future, or if you are willing to downgrade, say, your class of service to either economy or premium economy. Now, this could obviously be an episode in of itself because there's a couple of programs that are infamously dynamically priced. All of the American programs, for example, are. Our favorite Air Canada Aeroplan here. But just to give you an example of a success is that recently I got to go to Japan with about 3 or 4 months of lead time on booking the tickets, and it was only 120,000 Aeroplan round trip, plus like $140 in taxes and fees. Now, I'll pay that all day, every day, and that was a very comfortable flight, but it was an example where if I had wanted the business class flights, those would have been 150 to 200,000 points a direction. So I got a round trip in premium economy, which had excellent service, by the way, for less than the cost of a single direction in business class.
Yeah, that's a great redemption and using dynamic pricing to your benefit, to say the least. And that's one thing. So we all love Air Canada Aeroplan. It's a fantastic program. What you will see is if you search for flights on Air Canada Aeroplan, it'll most likely show you the Air Canada flights first. And those are the ones that are dynamically priced, and it can throw people off very quickly. They'll throw, an example of they want to go Vancouver to Tokyo on this one specific date because that's the only day they can travel. And it splits out a number like 458,000 points per direction. And they get discouraged. They get frustrated with the program. They don't see the value. They say Aeroplan is worthless, which is, great for all of us on the podcast because we see the value and we know how to use it. But you don't want to be that person. So one of the greatest things about Air Canada Aeroplan is the majority of their partners actually do not use dynamic pricing. So if you want to book, for example, the flight that Reed mentioned from JFK through Turkish to Singapore, that's not dynamically priced. So you know how much in advance you're going to pay. And that is a major plus when it comes to the earning point sides because you know how many points you need to save up to make that redemption.
Yep, I think, and that's a common theme, not just with Aeroplan, but lots of other programs. There's pockets of value in booking with their partners, whether it's part of an alliance or code share partners. So we see that with Alaska Miles or British Airways Avios would be another probably more relevant example.
So we've got our flights in place. We made our booking. Everything is good. Let's move on to the second part of the equation, which is hotel redemptions. What are your guys' strategies? Do you look for certain properties? Do you look based on the city you're going for? How do you find your hotels and what programs do you tend to lean towards using to make those bookings?
So for me, it depends on the property. If the hotel is the destination, then generally that's something that you kind of want to lock down first, just because destination hotels, like very popular hotels, sometimes award availability can be a little bit tricky. But award availability for hotels is generally something that's usually pretty good, and you won't run into many instances where you won't be able to find award availability at hotels, especially if you're able to engage with multiple programs such as Marriott, Hilton, Hyatt. If you're able to align your travels with those three programs, you're generally going to be able to find what you're looking for, unless you're going to a place like the Maldives, which I think is really honestly one of the very few examples of award availability being kind of tough to come by. But other than that, you're generally not going to have much trouble, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I have a similar approach. If I'm going somewhere specifically for the hotel or resort, I do try to lock that down before flights. Typically, hotels have crazy good cancellation policies. Normally, you're not out of pocket at all. And depending on the property, you might be able to cancel up to a month in advance or even 48 hours in advance, which is super helpful. So for those where I'm specifically traveling around the world to visit a certain resort or property, that's my strategy. For my Tokyo trip that's coming up, or Japan trip more broadly, once I made the flights, I looked at the points and tools such as free night certificates that I had available to me. So normally my logical order in making redemptions is I use anything that's going to expire first, and that's normally free night certificates. So whether you're using a Marriott free night certificate or a Hilton free night certificate, they all have expiry dates on them, and that expiry date is typically the date you need to actually make the stay by. So what I've done in the past is I will book all my free night certificates first, and then I will fill the rest of the gaps with point redemptions or even cash rates if it's reasonable, depending on the city you're going to or where you're visiting. Even staying non-chains can be a great value option.
So on that point, I'm curious, what's your thought process when you're looking at redeeming with, let's say, Marriott or Hilton? How do you know when you're looking at a particular property if the nightly rate is good value, poor value, if it's worth it to use points or to just stick with cash?
Man, so there's so many ways to calculate this just to try and figure out if it's worth it or not. I think what it really comes down to is what your mentality is, because if you are trying to compare against what the retail price is of a hotel as it's sold to the normal person on the street, then usually you'll get a very good value for your points. But if you're comparing it to a special rate or an industry rate that you might be entitled to with your company, then that value is going to go down potentially very, very fast. So the way I like to think of hotels is, do I want to go to this property, and is my goal to just not pay? And 9 times out of 10, it is to just not pay. So I just feel whatever I had to spend, it was valuable. That being said, there's going to be places that I don't care. Like, for example, I'm not spending 70, 80,000 Marriott Bonvoy on the St. Regis in Toronto. I'm sorry. It's just not worth it. I'm from Toronto, and I can tell you ain't nothing there worth 80,000 points.
I was just going to say, I think that that's a great approach to have. I've made some really great hotel redemptions, and like Kirin mentioned, just because, hotel is $2,000 a night doesn't mean I value my redemption at $2,000. I kind of view it more as the points cost, but I've also made what would be considered crappy redemptions, sending my significant other to Disneyland in October with a few of her sisters and burning 60,000 Hilton a night at a property nearby. That's like $250 USD a night, but it's a treat for them, and I'd rather not have them pay anything out of pocket, and we have the points on hand. So not the best redemption, but like Kirin said, sometimes paying nothing is the greatest reward as is.
That's a good point to make. There isn't really a perfect redemption, and at the end of the day, if you're happy with it, then it's, the value you get from it is subjective to some degree for sure. There are, calculators out there or blogs that will say, the value of a Marriott Bonvoy point is X number of cents. But I try not to focus too much on that and more just on the value that these points have to me or what I know that I can book with them otherwise.
Yeah. Well, thinking about it too, right? I don't look back on a trip fondly and say that was such an amazing trip because I got 8 cents per point. Nobody cares, frankly. I look back on it and say, wow, I stayed in that gorgeous resort in Thailand and it was stunning. And, I can't believe I was able to make this happen with miles and points. I do think as well, hotel points adjacent, be aware of all the ways that you can erode those hotel costs. So I talked a little bit about free night certificates before, and free night certificates are very different between World of Hyatt, Hilton Honors, and Marriott Bonvoy, with Hilton Honors being the most generous, where a free night certificate pretty much books you anywhere at a standard room, whether that's, a $200 Hilton Garden Inn or a $2,800 small luxury hotel of the world. There's crazy value to be had there. So the deeper you go within the hotel loyalty program game, there's some insane pockets of value that you can extract simply by holding a credit card and getting that annual free night every year.
And on top of that, if you have status as a result of, stays or as a result of holding the right credit card, you'll often get upgraded from that standard room.
Plus, free breakfast. I mean, we recently had an article come out from Jeff about Marriott breakfast, and I know he's all about that. And I think all of us can relate to not spending $40 or more every morning on breakfast per person.
Without a doubt. I'll just go back to free night certificates just for a sec in regards to Marriott, especially. I think they're really useful to combat surge pricing. And I like to have at least a couple of them always on hand because, just for example, I was just in Munich just overnight, and for those that don't know, the Euro Cup was going on while I was there, so the city was crazy and hotel prices were outrageous. I ended up staying at the Aloft Munich, and I think it was going for like $800 a night, and I was able to use a free night certificate and completely wipe out that nightly rate, and I would never even consider spending that on a lot anywhere. So super useful. Yeah, I got the free breakfast. It was terrific because, I mean, once you're in Europe, the breakfasts there are generally pretty awesome. So always having like a handful of free night certificates on hand will always come in really handy.
So we've talked a bit about flights, hotels. Those are probably the biggest component of what you need to make a trip happen. But there is still a lot of other points programs in Canada to be aware of and that you may be wanting to make redemptions with. And the biggest bucket of these other programs are bank-related or bank-affiliated points currencies. So with bank-related currencies, these also have many different redemption avenues, and they can be redeemed in ways that are very good value or not so good value. Some of the programs we've talked about previously include American Express membership rewards, which is definitely one of our favorite programs, as well as RBC Avion points. And these two are big winners for us because they're transferable. And so typically with these, the best value is going to be in transferring them to some of the partner programs. With American Express membership rewards, you can transfer to many different airlines, but a particular note is Aeroplan. And with RBC, you can transfer to British Airways Avios, as well as Cathay Pacific, WestJet, and American Airlines.
So one thing that I think should also be noted about currencies tied to banks, especially those issued by the big five banks in Canada, is that most of them operate on a model where it has a standard redemption value. So for example, CIBC Aventura, if you want to buy a flight, it's redeemable at 1.25 cents per point. So you get $1.25 for every 100 points that you redeem. Similarly, Scene Plus is another program where it's just 1-to-1. And then, for example, if you have their RBC Visa Infinite Privilege Avion card, that's going to be 2 cents per point on premium flights. So this is how the model works. With that in mind, in my opinion, it's exceptionally vital that people redeem their bank-denominated currencies as fast as possible, because these are some of the currencies that have historically been subject to the most aggressive devaluations, the most consistently. I just want to give an example for this, where I was working with an elderly couple who had just retired. They had been very successful business owners for a number of years. They asked me for some help with their points, and it was a tragedy. Because for many years, and I'm talking many years, they had been excellent customers at Bank of Montreal, and Bank of Montreal points had originally been redeemable at something in the vicinity of 1 cent per point. Then it went to, 0.8 of a cent per point. And then finally, by the time they retired and they were ready to go off into the sunset and go on a big trip, well, it was down to 2/3 of a cent a point. And, when they were running their business, they weren't aware of all of these changes. They weren't thinking about the maximum value. But you have to consider they had been very loyal customers. They had put millions in spend through. They had quite literally millions in points. And this devalued it from tens of thousands of dollars to thousands of dollars. So this is why I just want to say that it's important when things are denominated by a bank that I think it's even more important to earn and burn them than through currencies that are owned by third-party service providers such as airlines or hotels. Not that those can't be devalued. Bond void is a very infamous term in the miles and points community for a reason, but I don't think it has necessarily been subject to the same level of devaluations across the board unilaterally as these other programs.
Yeah, I agree. I have the same approach with those bank loyalty programs as I do try to use those points quickly. Or in the example of American Express membership rewards, if I'm on the Canada side of Amex, I tend to just transfer to Aeroplan. It's consistent. I will always have a use for Aeroplan points. On the US side, I'm a little bit more careful, but I don't like sitting on large chunks of points, in the hundreds of thousands, just because you never know what could happen.
Yeah, it can definitely be tricky because there's also programs that often have transfer bonuses. So, we definitely advocate for not sitting on points, but there can be niche cases where, you may anticipate that there's going to be a bonus of, 30% for transferring RBC to Avios, and then timing it with that bonus can result in actually having more points than you might have got otherwise.
Absolutely. It can be really tough to get that balance right.
And I think that definitely applies to convertible currencies more than fixed redemption currencies. But for the fixed redemption bank currencies, I think earn and burn can be preferable. Not that it is in 100% of cases, but it just generally is.
So thanks for tuning in to episode 3 of Miles Ahead. Hopefully this episode has helped you understand a little bit more about miles and points redemptions. While things have been relatively high level in this episode, we're going to use future episodes to continue to dive deeper into many of these topics, exploring things like the ins and outs of specific programs like Aeroplan and British Airways Avios, for example. Before we sign off, I'll remind you to please consider supporting Miles Ahead by subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. If you have any questions about the episode or anything we've talked about, we'd love for you to leave a comment on the episode page on frugalflyer.ca. And if you have a question you want us to answer on air, you can submit it on the main podcast page, frugalflyer.ca/podcast. Safe travels, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Miles Ahead.